Good afternoon or good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second of the webinars from the Digital CMC CERSI. So my name's Ian Howson. I'm a program manager here, and I'm delighted to be presented with Professor Valkyria Schlinwein from the University of De Montfort. So before we get into the talk, a little bit of housekeeping for everybody. So we will be recording the webinar. It will be available online along with the first webinar that we had, and we will share that with all the people that have registered, because obviously not everybody can necessarily attend. So those will both be available in the next couple of weeks. The webinar is scheduled to run for an hour, and we will aim to leave at least 10 minutes for questions and answers at the end. So if you do have any questions as we go through, please put them in the chat and we'll get to those at the end. If there's a whole load of questions, which would be fabulous, and we don't get through them on the day, we will follow up by email where we can find the correct respondent. So as I said, yes, this is the second session that we've run. So the first webinar was a higher level introduction to the CERSI, its aims, particularly the MHRA sponsorship, and then also some input from industry. So from AstraZeneca on sort of the drivers from their point of view of why we need this additional framework and guidance. So not regulatory guidance, but practical examples for how we accelerate the uptake of computational models in the CMC area. So, oops, this slide. Okay, so as I said, my name's Ian Howson. I'm the program manager here with the CERSI. So the project has nearly just about finished. So formally it finished a month ago, but there's a couple of us that are still completing pieces of work on it. So we're really driving. Valkyria, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself?
Okay, thanks, Ian. I'm a professor of pharmaceutics at De Montfort University, and I lead one of the work packages for this project, working in collaboration with CMAC and the other partners. So I'm here to talk about the framework, how we built, and then a little bit about the enablers.
Okay, great, thank you. So as I said, we'll talk a little bit about sort of the drivers for computational models, and then particularly with a focus on the CERSI. Valkyria will then talk about the outputs and walk through particularly some detail on the framework and the workflow. And then I'll finish off with one of our case studies. So in this case, some prediction around physical stability of tablets and dissolution time points. So we'll cover that. Before we get into it, then a bit of background. I think pretty much all of us have seen a huge increase in the regulation, the uptake, both from international regulators, government bodies, and also professional bodies. So ISPI, ASME are also, we know, going to be active in this area. So there's been a lot of growth in this area. And so really one of the things that we wanted to do was look at it and go, well, there's a range of digital tools, computational models. AI has been talked about a lot. AI is growing a lot. How does that fit into the existing environment, and where is it actually used? So as we've said, we've seen a huge growth and explosion in it. So everything, particularly in the medicinal products area, everything from drug discovery through development, and then particularly in the manufacturing side, some of the modeling and control, and examples around sort of maintenance prediction and things. But then also we're seeing it in other associated areas in the pharmaceuticals, so medical devices particularly in use in personalized medicine, so cell and gene therapy, but then also in the business side and supporting it. So regulatory administration, pharmacovigilance has also seen a growth in AI. And I think one of the things that we're really very keen to do is to sort of look at it and go, well, AI is part of it, but there's a whole host of material and guidance and structure that's been out there already for existing models. So how does AI fit into it? So before we jump into sort of the framework, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what do we actually mean by AI. So This is the framework and the description that we're using. So we're talking about two sort of groups, if you like, large groups of models. So knowledge-driven models and data-driven models. So knowledge-driven really could also be called mechanistic models, or rules-based models is the other word that's used quite frequently in here. So here we're talking about thermodynamics, kinetics, really where you understand the basic physics of it. And so you can set up some mathematical equations that describe the process. But we do know that there's a large number of areas where we don't understand the physics. We don't have enough knowledge to work everything out from first principles. And in these cases, we can collect some data and then we can model that data. So particularly things I'm thinking here, so empirical models, I might start to collect a whole range of different solubility curves, and I'll come back to this one later, which is I'm picking it here. And then we can fit an equation to that to describe it, to use it to predict into different conditions. So those are empirical models. And then we've got what you call the large data models. So this is where we use large data. We train some algorithms to really learn how to extract information and data and predictive capabilities. So there's three types here that we've covered. So I'll start with the one in the middle, so generative AI. This is the one that actually a lot of people talk about when they mean AI, and we can get very lazy about it. So we mean AI, and actually what they're talking about are large language models or generative AI. So things we're thinking about here, OpenAI, ChatGPT, Claude, a whole range of those sorts of models. But actually within the pharmaceutical area, and particularly within GMP, those are currently likely to be out of scope, and Valkyria will touch on those a little bit later. But particularly machine learning and deep learning very much are in scope for the pharmaceutical area, and particularly in CMC. And so examples of this, so deep learning, probably the most well-known one is image processing. So here what we're doing is, image inspection. So for example, we're making up vials, so for parenteral drugs, and we're using machine learning algorithms. We've been able to train the deep learning tool to be able to look at the vials and look for any defects in the vials, so cracks, but also to look at things like particulate formation, things that are the wrong color. And because it's, you can take photos a lot faster than the human eye, this can be a lot more efficient. And there's a number of examples of those that are already out there and in use in large scale commercial manufacturing. Machine learning is also heavily used and has been well used and well described for 20 or 30 years now. So areas for this, so particularly used in process development. Certainly one of the examples we've got is around process monitoring. So monitoring how feeders and hoppers will go into a continuous blender and then into a continuous direct compression line. So by collecting large amounts of data and developing these algorithms, we can predict performance of the materials. So take home from the slide really is AI covers lots of different types of tools, and we need to be very careful that we use exactly the correct wording. So machine learning, deep learning, if we're in a CMC space and we're going to be using this in a GMP environment, those are very much currently in scope at the moment and acceptable. If it's generative AI, then there's a way to go. Yeah, Valkyria will talk a little bit about the Annex 22 revisions are coming that do talk specifically about generative AI. So that's the AI space and the wording and the nomenclature that we're using. So the other sort of background piece I'll come from, and I think this is one of our main drivers. So quality by design is now well established. It maybe isn't used still by everybody, but as a principle and how it's used, it's pretty common amongst a large number of submissions in GMP environments. So within this space, we do large number of experiments. We develop a design space. We might use design of experiments and those sorts of things. And with that, we can build ourselves design space, process understanding, and then that will help us to model the process and link critical quality attributes to the process parameters. and we can run that. Being able to develop and design that design space gives us within the manufacturing space some flexibility of where we can operate a process and continue to that continuous improvement piece. Where we want to move, though, is quality by digital design. And I think what we're seeing, and we've certainly seen this here at the University of Strathclyde, is that if we're able to build sort of from a digital first principle, so rather doing experiments first and building a design space, what are the things that we can model to start with, and then use multi-objective optimization. Not only can we absolutely assure the quality, that is sacrosanct, we don't touch that, but it allows us to optimize against a number of other things. So examples that we've done, it might be sustainability, it might be manufacturability. So for example, if I'm doing a crystallization, I'd much rather make nice round crystals that will have nice flowability. Ideally, I'll make them 100 microns, so they're very similar size to my excipients, and I know my blending will be much more efficient. So we can use that digital design piece to really help us optimize where we are and have a digitally augmented design space early on, really, if we start right from the beginning. So we've done some of that experiments. So we've done a number of examples here now, and we've published a white paper earlier in the year, last year, and then also a follow-up case studies paper. And as part of that case studies paper with that work, 3 examples. So in our case, because it's where our expertise is, crystallization and isolation, 3 exemplar processes. We were able to use sort of 50 to 60% less material and about 30% fewer experiments. So really focusing on small scale experiments, getting the parameterization of the models right. So a mixture of first principles models, but also data-driven models as well. So that's sort of the background to quality by digital design. And so I will hand over to Valkyria, who will talk a little bit more. We'll come back to the case studies, but to the drivers for it.
Thank you, Ian. Before I go into the aims and objectives of the CERSI itself and describe a little bit of the rationale for this project, one of the first things that we have done was a survey to learn more about how digital tools and AI tools have been used within this industry. So we had 26 respondents across UK, US, Germany, Switzerland, Ireland, Brazil, and Japan. So a very good response. And most of the respondents were from big pharma and innovators. And we've learned a lot from what they have said. So we've compiled this into a paper that has been submitted last week, and hopefully you will have the full picture of the survey very soon, will be available to all of you. So what was the motivation for this survey? We know that from industry that a lot of the models and computational models have been used for many years, but very few go into submissions. So this gap raises an important question to us. What distinguishes a useful internal model that works well from one that is sufficiently mature, robust, and well evidenced for regulatory inclusion? So with this in mind, we've collated the responses and we've tried to see what we can take from that and apply into our CERSI, the CMC CERSI. And this slide just shows some of the responses that are related to drivers and challenges. And as you can see, one of the main drivers was related to increased process robustness, and one of the main challenges was related to regulatory expectations are not harmonized across different markets. So now let's talk about the CERSI, what the CERSI is doing. The next slide, please. The Digital CMC CERSI. CERSI is the Center of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation, and is being sponsored by and supported by the MHRA. So the overall aim is unlock the benefits of digital transformation in chemistry, manufacturing, and control, or CMC, across the pharmaceutical industry, regulators, academia, and the wider society. So the CERSI creates a trusted, safe space where these groups can collaborate. So, this is very important. They can align on regulatory expectations, reduce duplications, and support a safe and predictable adoption of digital innovation. So, that is our main drivers. And from the MHRA perspective, the objectives include in strengthening partnerships, support regulatory science research, and transferring knowledge development, the regulatory workforce as well, and ensuring a long-term sustainability. So for the digital CMC specifically, the CERSI will focus on three priorities: developing a forward-looking and standardized regulatory maturity framework on computational models, create an impact in areas such as AI and predictive modeling, and deliver practical digital CMC training for regulators, industry, and academia. So this is very important. It's not only the framework, but there are a lot of enablers that I will mention later on in my talk that are extremely important. So overall, this initiative is all about building confidence, capability, and alignment so that digital innovation in CMC can be adopted safely and effectively. So that is the overall aiming and objective. So if we move on now into next slide. Well, before I go into one of the main outcomes, which is the framework, we would like to thank all the partners, and the CERSI is underpinned by a strong and diverse network spanning academia, industry, and regulation. So we are led from CMAC, as Ian has already mentioned, based at the University of Strathclyde, and we work in close collaboration with the Montfort, where I'm based, the Glasgow School of Art, and the CCDC in Cambridge, and also the companies AstraZeneca, Pfizer, BMS, GSK, and Siemens, and the MHRA are the main partners. So beyond our core partners, we are actively engaging with growing numbers of regulatory agencies, including the FDA, EMA, and the PMDA, and other pharmaceutical companies and professional bodies from around the world. So the network is expanding, is growing, and that broader engagement is vital. So we can ensure that the work we do is relevant, representative, and impactful. If you if you're a user and you come to work with us, we have developed this landing page where you can access all the outputs that we have created so far. And these include the framework itself, the workflow, case studies, the AI assistant, Vera, the training platform that has got all the training that we've developed so far, and the sandbox. So all these is very interactive and available online, easy access for interaction. So I will now move into the main CERSI output, is starting with the Digital CMC Regulatory Lifecycle Framework, and is short for DCRL. And I will talk about how it was structured and built. So the framework, if you go from left to right, the lighter blue to the darker blue, there are 4 life cycles levels that we've based on, starting from concept and risk analysis, development and verification, validation and uncertainty quantification. Ian will go more in depth into those levels. And finally, the regulatory use and life cycle management. So these life cycle levels are also supported by the UK MHRA 5 AI regulatory principles, which are safety, security and robustness, appropriate transparency and explainability, fairness, accountability and governance, and contestability and redress. The advantage of this structure, so this foundation, is that it makes clear that different questions need to be answered at different stages. It also shows that credibility is built across the life cycle rather than demonstrated in single steps, which is quite important. So the framework is designed to apply to computational models more generally, not only AI, and Ian has already touched upon this. So the aim is to provide a structured way that model development, credibility assessment, regulatory use, and lifecycle management can be done effectively. It is important to highlight these 5 principles and how they are not unique to UK, but are broadly aligned with the direction being taken by other regulators, standard bodies, and international organizations. As you can be seen from this slide, the groups listed there across the principles. And we can see that similar themes have been used, such as safe and robust system, transparency, appropriate governance, responsible use, etc. So although different organizations may use a slightly different wording, there is a strong global convergency around the same core expectations. And this really reassures us for the digital CMC CERSI. This is helpful because it means our framework is not being developed in isolation, but it really uh, it reinforced that this is what we are doing in line with what is adopted across the globe. In addition to this, to the 5 principles that are important to take on board, we also use the existing regulatory foundation guidelines, such as the ICH quality guidelines, particularly the Q8 to more recently the Q14 as well. These guidelines are extremely important. And on top of that sits the national and regional guidance from agencies such as FDA, EMA, MHRA, and PMDA, and also new AI and digital related materials that have been published. And on top of that, the international standards and frameworks such as ISO's, ISPE, the ASME, the VV40, and we are just waiting for the next one to come along, the VVUQ80, that will be also important to the development of this framework. So the important message here is that the framework brings all these existing sources together into a practical structure for the development and assessment of computational model in CMC, and not forgetting they are underpinned also by the 5 core principles that I've mentioned before. So moving on from the framework into the workflow, the next layer shown here in this diagram is more specifically to how we implement this in practice. So the framework tells us what matters, the workflow shows how to implement it in real life. So it is designed to support a risk-based credibility assessment that is core, that is applicable across different computational model types and aligned with existence guidance, as I said before. So we have developed, I will talk about this a little bit later. So the next stage is the enablers, or the next layer on this diagram is the enablers that are also very important, because the framework on its own is not sufficient. People need to be trained. You need to have examples that show effectively how these can be implemented. And also we have created a sandbox where it is a safe space where you can evaluate credibility of those models in a safe space. So on top of that, also we have created a training platform, which I will also talk about a little bit later. Now, we show here in a nutshell that the framework moves from early concept and data collection through development and credibility assessment towards a stage where both the model and its supporting documentation are ready for regulatory submission and also inspections. So it is important that the framework also considers the life cycle management, as I said before, but eventually also decommission has to be also to take into consideration. Eventually, at some stage, some of these models will be decommissioned. So it is explicitly a life cycle view rather than a one-off validation exercise, as I mentioned before. Next slide shows specifically the workflow. This is the core of the model development. And we need to make sure that this is done correctly and verifying that it behaves as intended. So that includes the quality of the data, the appropriateness of the modeling approach, and the documentation need to explain what has been done. It's important. It is a technical core of the modeling development, but it also needs to be done in a way that remains inspection and submission ready. So the harmonization of all the guidances and the framework that is already published, all the literature that is already published around the use of models, it's important that we harmonize in a way that it makes sense and it has got stages that everybody can follow and is clear to regulators and users. So the framework, as I said before, is supported by enablers. So this is the next slide. And looking at this more carefully, we have here the case studies, the virtual expert regulatory assistant or VERA, the model specific training platform, and the digital sandbox. The reason we emphasize this is the framework, as I said, on its own, it's really not enough. People need examples, they need a safe environment for exploration and opportunities for training if the approach is to be used consistently and effectively in a regulatory framework scenario. I will talk a little bit more about VERA, which is the next slide. VERA was designed to help users navigate a curated library of regulatory guidance, standards, white papers, and scientific best practice papers that have been is available. This is important. So it's a curated library. The content was collated by experts, tagged with metadata, and responses include citations. So VERA is not intended to replace regulatory expertise, but to make relevant information easier to find and use. At this stage, the tool is only being currently available for internal use of the digital CMC CERSI members, but hopefully in future this will be widely available. The next slide just shows VERA in action. We have a video. The intention here is just to show you a video where you can ask regulatory CMC questions and receive responses drawn from a selected guidance, standards, and scientific documents. So VERA can also filter information, for example, by region or by regulators, which helps users find the most relevant material much quicker And Vera is our virtual librarian, for that matter, so helping users access the right information while reducing the risk of supported or hallucinated answers, which we don't want. So this is a very controlled environment that we have provided to the users. And to finish off, my last, before I hand over to Ian, the skill factory. This is absolutely important because building skills for the future is essential. The aim is to provide modular training so different groups can choose what is most relevant to them. So what do they need is there available. So the modules cover at the moment the framework itself, the workflow, the digital CMC sandbox, the computational model concepts, so the basic of some of the models that we have used, scientific background in general, model evaluation, the Vera obviously, and some webinar that we have recorded that are available as well. So consistency is crucial. We want everybody to use the same language, the methodologies and approaches when discussing modeled credibility and regulatory use. So that is very important. Now, the last thing that I want to show before I hand over to Ian is the dynamic interactive framework is the next slide. We had this on paper to begin with, and it was quite daunting to get our heads around this amount of information that is there, and this table became very big and quite unusable, to be a nice way to say. And now we have an interactive framework where you can click in any of those boxes, including the workflow itself, and that provides you some more information as you go deeper and you click more boxes, and it is there to support implementation and training and discussion, and remaining only a live document instead of conceptual kind of paper-based document. And I will stop now, and I hand over to Ian, who is going to talk about an example of a case study, how to put this in practice. Ian, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Valkyria. Okay, so as Valkyria said, we've been working with some case studies. So really, this was actually twofold, partly to help us think our way through it, but we particularly deliberately picked different types of models. When we started, we picked models that we had experience of. We didn't want to be spending our lives developing new models or inventing new models. This was really about how do we apply a workflow, how do we develop a credibility assessment across lots of different model types. So as it happens, we do actually end up with different risk levels as well, and I'll talk about those. So we have 4 different ones. So one that I'm going to talk about particularly around stability prediction. We have a much lower risk model around solubility prediction. So this is really about organic compounds in organic solvents. So thinking about synthesis and isolation in drug substance manufacture. We have a risk model around polymorph assessment, so polymorph stability prediction. And then the last one is around sort of some soft sensors for monitoring of a continuous direct compression line. So a series of machine learning models, a system of models as they're known. So the one that I'm going to talk about is this empirical model here on the right-hand side. And this is really about tablet physical stability prediction. So what do I mean by that? So tablet physical stability prediction. So tablets, you want them to dissolve, you want them to release a certain amount of your active pharmaceutical ingredient, your API, within a certain amount of time. So typically you'll have an 80% release within, if it's a fast release tablets, 15 minutes as a standard example of your critical quality attribute for your material, so your dissolution rate. However, it is known that over time, tablets will gradually, I guess for want of a better phrase, degrade. That's maybe not the correct quality and say it's a quality term, but the dissolution rate of a tablet actually gets slower. So you still get the same amount, the assumption is you still get the same amount of material out of the tablet, but the dissolution rate is slower. So what that means is, in terms of actually being able to predict shelf lives, you need to be very careful, because if your tablet, that dissolution rate degrades a lot faster, then your shelf life will be shorter than one that's more stable. So typically how it's currently done is that you will take your tablets, you will store them at different temperature and relatively humidity conditions, and you will take them out at various time points and sample the dissolution rate. You'll monitor that over a series of time. So what you can then do is start to predict it. Now, in the current guidelines and typical ways of working, you do your stability, accelerated stability, and you'll normally get double the amount of time you've done. So if I've done a 2-month study, I'd maybe be able to get a 4-month shelf life. And then as we go along and we collect more data and update with the regulators, they then will able to extend the shelf life. So that's very good, but it really, the prediction capability that we have now is a lot better than it used to be. And so we're sort of 2 to 3 month storage times. We're starting to see we've seen a number of examples where, prediction is realistic up to 12 to 18 months. So we really wanted to take this as a strong example and be able to run a credibility assessment on it. So the first thing that we have to do as part of our credibility assessment is describe the model. So in this case here, it's actually a series of steps that we go through. So as before, we take a series of model dissolution profiles, different temperatures, different humidities, so a range of those, and then at different time points that we take our samples. And so the graph that you can see on the left, that's an example solubility per unit time. And then what we see in our middle one is that we actually convert all of our various samples into the decay model. And this really then looks at how that decay, the sort of rate of dissolution reduces over time. So that's what you're seeing here is that as time goes on the x-axis, the dissolution rate reduces. And then what we can do is convert that into the model, the stability prediction element, and we'll then be able to predict our shelf life at standard ICH conditions for storage. So that's the model. So we described the model. So if we go back to the workflow, where do we start? What's my question of interest and what's my context of use? So these are reasonably well established. I think question of interest and context of use has been locked now. Everything from, as Valkyria said, V and V40, model-informed drug development also have a reasonable amount of guidance out in here. And then there's been a range of guidance as well, both from the FDA in their guidance that was published last year. So in our case, we're looking at a question of interest about long-term dissolution performance and whether we're able to use the prediction to assign a shelf life. I think our experience is the question of interest needs to be nice and short, and you want ideally a yes/no answer. And then the next part of it is the context of use. So this is really, what actually am I going to do? So it will define the compound I'm going to use, the types of shelf life I'm asking for, the uncertainty or the levels of variability I might accept, as well as things like storage conditions and any other environmental factors. So this is really where you describe where your model has to be valid. If it's not valid in this point, it doesn't matter because it's outside your context of use. It's almost like your design space. It's defining where the model will be appropriate. So in this case, we actually have the tablets that we're doing because of the experience that we have here at the university is actually in an open dish format. So they're uncoated tablets as well. So, you could argue that actually they should be in blister packs or however you're going to be selling your tablets. But in this case, for this context of use, that's the description we're using. So we describe how we're going to use it. We've already picked our models in this example because we know which, that was how we selected them in the first place. We picked ones that we wanted to know. Okay, so our next one is a risk assessment. This is a two-part risk assessment, so it's not the older, more traditional one where there's a single score, but particularly where we're thinking about computational models, we talk about model influence and then decision consequence. So the model influence is around the contribution that model makes to enabling you to make a decision. And then the decision consequence is if the model predicts, so this worst case scenario, the model predicts the wrong answer, how bad is it? And this is particularly how bad is it to the patient? What's the impact it does there? So in our case here, we have a medium level of model influence because, as I said, we're not in blister packs, and this is really strongly indicative, though, of how the tablet performs. And then the decision consequence, I think this is one where we've actually had a number of points where we actually gone, hang on a minute, we need to go back and define our context of use more. So particularly, are there any additional downstream tests or monitoring that we're doing that will affect the decision consequence? And that really has a very large effect on the risk. So if there's no further test downstream, the risk is much higher than if you have multiple additional tests downstream. And so that I think we did find we had a number of iterations through this as we went through the process and learned ourselves how to do it. So that's our risk assessment. Oh, sorry, I'm clicking the wrong one. That's why nothing's happening. Next, we move into really defining what we're going to do for our credibility assessment. So here, that's data collection. So this is describing what I'm going to collect, how I'm going to collect it, how do I make sure that my sampling is not biased, that I have enough data for my set. So how do I make sure I've covered all the requirements? So thinking back to some of those points that Valkyria has mentioned in the 5 principles, although a lot of those principles were written for AI, most of them actually are quite applicable to nearly any model type. Not all of them are, but several of them are, and that's why we've included them all as a conscious aid memoir to help people think through the various steps they need to consider. Even if they consider it and go, actually here it's not relevant, but at least you've made that decision. You've had a conscious decision at this stage. So we then have data pre-treatment guide. That's fairly standard, and really just really setting out to say what you're going to do up front. Next, we have the actual credibility assessment. So this table here is the plan, but what we find is that as we go through the plan and we complete each of those stages, if we collate them into a table and a document afterwards, this then actually becomes our credibility assessment report as well. So there's a whole range of areas here, again, taken initially from AI and machine learning, but then what we've done is we've modified it a number of times, and within the papers that we're going to be publishing, we'll talk a bit about how they vary. So the difference between how you approach certain things in knowledge-driven versus data-driven models. And so you can see here there's some that we think are applicable, some that are not applicable, and then there's a number that may be applicable depending on the model type. So that helps us set up, identify what we're going to do. And then what we have here is a series of tables. Now, apologies, we're having some issues with uploading the files and the activity. These were meant to build. Each click was meant to come up extra. So something's got into our slides, and I do apologize for that because there's a couple of slides earlier I noticed that weren't right. So what we're able to do is that, as I said, as we go through each of the stages in the table, we can record that. So in our case, we're using the sandbox to do that. So this is a digital sandbox that as we collate data and update it, it structures it and stores it all in one place so that then it's findable and searchable later on. So we look at the various stages in the map. So we'll describe the model, we'll describe the data, we'll describe the processing, and then the actual credibility evaluation. So what am I actually doing and how do I run that? So that's all, that sort of report, if you like, as you go through it is collected. And that then takes you into the model credibility assessment part. So We haven't got a specific example here of the actual final decision, because that's very much a disciplinary and regulatory decision, and we're currently just working through the final bits of the uncertainty quantification in our model. So we've not entirely finished this case study yet. But one thing that we would like to highlight here, and this is, I think, the bit that we're probably the most excited about in the sandbox, is so one part is a static credibility assessment that can help support the regulatory submissions or any GMP inspections. But there's also an interactive, and this builds on the data sets that you've set up, and it enables a user, so whether it's a colleague from QA or somebody from manufacturing or a regulator who wants to come in and understand the model more and test it. And so you're able to change the various data sets. So we have some structured training. So if you change this, if you change that, you expect to see this. But it also allows people to go through and play around, remove data sets that they want to add extra ones in. So it helps build trust and transparency into models and really reduce that perceived risk or real risk of a novel technology and a new thing that people bring in. So that interactive part is something we're really excited with, and we'll be publishing on that in the near future. Okay, so that really in terms of where we've got to in the project so far. So this has been a 1-year project. We've just come to the end of the first tranche of funding. And so that's really where our project has currently finished. We do believe there will be where we're very hopeful we'll be successful in securing some follow-on funding, and that will allow us to look at the lifecycle management and pick up some additional case studies, particularly in large molecules. I think is an area that we'd like to work on. So as I said, those are coming. Stage 8 is very much driven by the EMA's recent Quality Innovation Group's discussions about the risk, and particularly how much the information is in the supporting detail that's needed for regulatory submissions. So it's not the risk to the patient per se, although it is, but it's very much focused on what information needs to then go into a regulatory submission, or if you have an inspection, the amount of supporting data and information you should have available. So as I said, so that's where I'm going to finish the detail. The slide, when it turns up, is a summary of where we've got to within the year. As Valkyria said, we've been delighted with the engagement we've had and the positive response to what we're doing from the regulatory agencies. And we'd like to formally thank them for the time and effort they've spent, engaging with us and talking with us. And we look forward to keeping to work with them in the future. So I think for the sake of time, I'll maybe not go through this particularly. I think other than to say I guess really just the key message for us is AI is a continuation of the existing work that's been done in computational science. So the computational models and simulation work and all those approaches. This is an evolution of that. I think generative AI is currently out of scope from a GMP environment, and certainly Annex 22, as the draft wording is currently written, suggests that generative AI will continue to be excluded from GMP critical operations. I think that, as the rate of change of that we're seeing around this, those safeguards will massively increase over the next few years. But that's just a personal view. So I'd like to thank everybody for their time. If you want to find out more, we have a website that is in the process. As I said, we're finishing up things here. So the website doesn't have a huge amount of information on it, but it will do within probably the next 4 to 6 weeks. As Valkyria said, we have the survey paper being published, and we have two other papers that we're in the final stages of writing. So one is a general white paper on the structure and the philosophy, and then one is a much more detailed case studies paper that will focus on the workflow in detail, and then the 4 case studies. So with that, I shall probably stop at that point. So a couple of questions then in terms of accessing the materials. So particularly, I guess, if I pick up, so Vera access and the training materials. So Vera, currently it's just restricted to these CERSI partners. As much as anything, actually, it's sort of more of a budget and business case of what happens next until we're aware of what the next round of funding is likely to be. We're not quite sure what the business model for that be. We're very keen to make it as widely available as we possibly can, but just at the moment, we're not quite sure what that's going to look like. What we will absolutely do is let all the, be as open as we can, and as soon as we have more concrete information on how we'll be able to access that, we'll talk it. If people have specific interests, questions, we're very happy to follow up on a case-by-case basis. Similarly, actually, that's slightly similar to the training. I think we are able to come and do sort of, some face-to-face training. The training is online, but as I said, as yet, we do not have a formal sort of business case of how we're going to run that until we're aware of what the next round will be. So I'm sorry, that feels like probably a poor answer to your question, but unfortunately, it's more a reality of where we are. So I think you've probably heard me talk quite a lot. So I'm going to pass back to Valkyria. So Gert Drau has asked, could you possibly comment on the applicability of older existing frameworks for training-based modelling, such as PAT guidance? And how is it different from the formal credibility assessment? I guess maybe Valkyria, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, Gert, I think this is a very good question. The PAT is being used and accepted by regulators for many years, and we follow very much the steps that were used for the VV40 in terms of credibility assessment with adaptation. But I'm sure that we haven't done a parallel comparison with all the frameworks and such as PAT guidance, but there is a lot of overlap between the two. But because also the FDA guidance that was published early last year, they heavily also have adopted the VV40 steps and framework. We decided to go along those lines instead of trying to cater for what was already there in terms of PAT. But chemometrics models and these type of models associated with PAT very well established, and all the verification, validation procedure and what goes into regulatory submissions is quite robust. So I think I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but for us, what we should do is go back and just make sure that if we've missed anything from what is already there, we should look at it again. But I don't think we did. And most of the main core credibility assessment around different model types, and we've tried to include, and this is very important, to not be just model types in general. And that's where we decided to go to. I don't know, Ian, if you have anything to add on.
Yeah, I think in some ways I think sort of PAT and particularly chemometric models, it's actually a good question about, because I think almost in my head I was almost like, well, that's so well established. People know what they're doing. There's such good guidance on the validation, the verification, that almost you could use this style and this structure. And we've deliberately not gone into how people should do verification and validation because, that's well guided. So I think as ever, there will always be an element of you find the most appropriate one for your I'm going to say computational model, and actually maybe what we need to do is to actually go and just really clarify which computational models we would really recommend you do this way, which ones actually there's all plenty of pre-existing data and you should go that way. And that would actually be, I think now the more I think about it, actually would be a really valid thing for us to do. So,
definitely. Well, thank you for the question. Good.
Yeah. Yes. That one, yes. We'll leave the Annex 22 draft wording discussion for another day. I know that's still under discussion. It is still very much draft wording. Yeah. So that brings us to 2:00. So it just, leaves me to thank particularly, Valkyria, obviously, for taking the time to talk, but also Sarah Elizabeth, who has been making things work very smoothly in the background. So a particular thanks to her, and thanks to Daniel Markle, who unfortunately wasn't able to make it today just for a number of reasons, but thank you to him as well for leading the project.
And thank you all the ones that watched the webinar. So please get in touch. This is an incredible project, and we are all excited. It was a brilliant year. I think the group worked really well together, and we want to see this growing with time. So be in touch, and we will share what we can with you as we go along.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.